On a frigid November morning in 1978, a woman named Galina Volkova entered a KGB office in Leningrad. Her choice that day would cast a long shadow over her remaining years. She was 50 years old, a devoted Soviet citizen who had never doubted the state's righteousness. She carried information about her son, believing it would offer him salvation. The sleepless night prior had been spent meticulously preparing her words. She repeatedly assured herself she was acting correctly, that the system would show leniency, and that her son would be granted an opportunity for atonement. She was mistaken on all counts. Galina had lived her entire existence within the established framework of Soviet society, and this had been her sole desire. She was born in a small village near Novograd and endured her formative years during the harshest period of Stalin's rule. Her childhood was characterized by scarcity, apprehension, and the pervasive presence of state propaganda, which assured her that hardship was temporary, a glorious future lay ahead, and the party held the ultimate wisdom. She had believed this then, and she continued to believe it. At 16, she relocated to Leningrad to work in a textile mill. In 1948, she met her future husband, Pota, at a factory dance. He was a mechanic, a man of few words with skilled hands and no political inclinations. They wed in 1950, and their son, Leonid, was born in 1957. Pota passed away unexpectedly in October 1977, succumbing to a heart attack at his workplace at the age of 53. His death was a profound blow. Yet Galina intensified her daily routines. She fulfilled her factory shifts, attended party gatherings, and maintained the home meticulously. She took pride in her role within the factory's trade union committee, where she helped coordinate cultural events and socialist competitions. She had always embodied adherence to rules, believing that diligence and loyalty would be rewarded, and trusting that the Soviet Union was constructing a superior future to what had existed previously. Leonid, her only child, had always been a source of immense pride. He was a diligent student, quiet, and scholarly. When he was accepted into Leningrad State University in the autumn of 1976, Galina felt her and Pota's sacrifices had been validated. Leonid was pursuing a history degree, a respected discipline that could lead to a teaching post, or perhaps employment in a museum or archive. To economize, he resided at home, commuting to campus daily via tram. For the initial 18 months, all appeared normal. He attended his lectures, returned home for meals, and spent his evenings engrossed in reading or composing essays. Galina had no inkling that anything was amiss. However, by early 1978, she began to observe subtle shifts in her son's demeanor. Initially, these changes were so minor she dismissed them. Leonid started returning home later in the evenings, citing group study sessions or the necessity of using the university library. He grew more reticent and withdrawn, spending extended periods in his room with the door shut. When questioned about his classes or companions, his responses were terse and vague. He seemed preoccupied, burdened by something he refused to divulge. Then Galina noticed something that disturbed her more profoundly. Leonid had always been frugal with money. Both had to subsist on her factory wages and his modest student stipend. Yet, one evening, she observed him arrive home carrying a bag from one of the more upscale state-run stores, establishments that offered superior merchandise at prices beyond the reach of most individuals. When asked about his purchase, he displayed a new pair of leather shoes, well-crafted and costly. He claimed he had saved for them, setting aside a small sum each month. While plausible, a subtle unease settled upon her due to his peculiar explanation. Throughout the summer, other disquieting incidents emerged. In July, she discovered a new leather briefcase in his room, the type favored by professors, far more elegant than the worn canvas bag he typically used. In August, he returned with a substantial wool sweater, a deep blue hue and expertly tailored, which must have cost at least 30 rubles. When she inquired about the source of the funds, he stated he had undertaken additional work, assisting a professor with research over the summer and organizing materials in the university archives. This was the sort of employment students sometimes secured, and Galina wished to believe him, but the increasing frequency of these acquisitions began to trouble her. A new fountain pen, a leather-bound notebook, a heavy winter coat that appeared unworn, its fabric still crisp and new upon his arrival. Leonid was not ostentatiously displaying his newfound affluence. In fact, he seemed intent on concealing it. He kept the new acquisitions in his room, wore his older clothing when within the apartment, and only revealed the finer items when he believed she was not observing. However, Galina missed nothing. She had always possessed a keen sense of observation, attuned to the routines of her modest household, and the transformations in Leonid's behavior weighed heavily on her thoughts. By the autumn of 1978, her apprehension had intensified into a palpable fear. She began to conjure scenarios, each more alarming than the last. Perhaps Leonid had fallen in with a disreputable circle, students involved in the black market or petty larceny. Perhaps he had incurred debt with individuals of a dangerous nature. He might have become entangled in illicit activities, actions that could bring disgrace upon their family, or worse, attract the scrutiny of the authorities. The Soviet Union was replete with tales of young individuals who had made grave errors and suffered severe repercussions. Galina was determined her son would not become another cautionary story. She attempted to converse with him on several occasions, posing gentle inquiries about his life, his companions, his studies. Leonid, however, circumvented every overture. He assured her that all was well, that he was merely occupied with academic pursuits, and that there was no cause for concern. His tone was patient yet distant, and Galina could feel the barrier he had erected between them. She reminded herself that he was 21 years old, an adult, and that she ought to respect his privacy. Yet the worry gnawed at her, particularly during the late hours when she lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the building settling around her. The pivotal moment occurred on the afternoon of November 3rd, 1978. Galina had a rare day off from the factory, and Leonid had departed for campus early that morning, stating his lectures extended into the evening. She spent the morning tending to household chores, washing dishes and sweeping floors. But by midday, she found herself standing before Leonid's closed bedroom door, her heart pounding. She had never before searched his room. Throughout his years of living at home, she had respected his privacy, treating his personal space as his own. However, the accumulation of minor anxieties, the unanswered questions, the profound sense that something was gravely amiss impelled her forward. She rationalized that she was acting as a responsible parent, that she had a right to know if her son was in difficulty. She turned the handle and entered. The room was small and somewhat disorganized, with a narrow bed against one wall and a desk piled high with textbooks and papers. She commenced her search at the desk, opening drawers and perusing notebooks. She discovered lecture notes, essays bearing grades, a few letters from former school friends who had relocated to other cities. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as she moved to the wardrobe and began sorting through his clothing, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the drawers, she found that which she had been dreading. Concealed beneath a stack of folded shirts, wrapped in a plain handkerchief, lay a substantial wad of cash. Galina withdrew it and gazed at it, her mind struggling to comprehend the sight. Neatly stacked rubles, secured with a rubber band, far more than a university student should possess. She counted rapidly, her fingers fumbling. Over 400 rubles, exceeding her earnings for 3 months at the factory. She sat on the edge of Leonid's bed, the money still in her hands, and felt the world spin beneath her. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in a daze, attempting to reconcile what she had discovered. She considered every conceivable explanation. Perhaps Leonid had been saving for years, meticulously hoarding every kopeck, but this did not account for the new apparel, the briefcase, the shoes. Perhaps he had won money through some means, though gambling was illegal and Leonid had never exhibited any interest in it. Perhaps someone had bestowed it upon him. But who, and for what reason? The more she contemplated, the more her thoughts gravitated toward the most ominous possibilities. That her son was involved in criminal activity, something that could jeopardize his future. When Leonid returned home that evening, shortly after 8 o'clock, Galina was awaiting him in the kitchen. She had mentally rehearsed her words, but upon seeing him enter, his face weary and unsuspecting, the words became lodged in her throat. She compelled herself to speak. She instructed him to sit down, and then placed the bundle of money on the table between them. Leonid's complexion turned ashen. For an extended moment, he remained silent. Galina could perceive the panic in his eyes, the rapid computations as he endeavored to formulate a response. Then he began to protest. He claimed the money was not his, that he was holding it for a friend. He insisted he had been saving it, that he had been engaged in extra work unbeknownst to her. His explanations cascaded forth, each one contradicting the preceding one, and Galina realized he was being untruthful. She pressed him more forcefully, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain composure. She informed him that she had seen the new attire, the briefcase, the footwear. She declared that she knew something was amiss and that he needed to divulge the truth. Finally, after nearly an hour of evasion and half-truths, Leonid faltered. He reclined in his seat, an arm draped over his face, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. He disclosed that the funds originated from a university acquaintance, a postgraduate student identified as Oleg Petrov. Oleg appeared to be in his late 20s, specifically 26 or 27 years old, and possessed a campus reputation for being well off, consistently having resources that others lacked. Leonid had encountered him during a seminar, and they had developed a friendship. Oleg was charismatic, intelligent, and convincing, gradually bringing Leonid into his confidence. At a later, unremembered date, Oleg approached Leonid with a proposal. He required assistance with a project. The particulars remained ambiguous, but Oleg elaborated that he was circulating specific items on campus, writings and essays that offered alternative viewpoints on Soviet history and governance. Some of these works were critical of the ruling party, others challenged official accounts, and a few were translations of pieces by Western authors or Soviet dissidents who had faced exile or imprisonment. Oleg needed someone to help him strategically place these materials in areas frequented by students: library reading nooks, communal spaces, and dormitory lounges. Oleg assured him it posed no danger, merely an effort to stimulate critical thought and expose students to concepts absent from formal instruction. He also offered remuneration, not a vast sum, but sufficient to be meaningful. 20 rubles here, 40 rubles there, contingent upon the task. For a student on a tight budget, this constituted a considerable amount. Leonid initially expressed hesitation, but Oleg's persuasive approach prevailed. He framed it as an intellectual endeavor, a means of fostering authentic dialogue and discussion. He eloquently spoke of the importance of questioning authority and seeking truth beyond propaganda. Leonid, always a curious and contemplative individual, found himself increasingly drawn into the arrangement. He rationalized it as harmless, simply aiding in the distribution of reading matter with no resulting harm, and the financial incentive eased his conscience. Galina absorbed this account with mounting apprehension. She inquired about the origin of Oleg's materials, and Leonid confessed his ignorance. He had once asked, but Oleg had been vague, merely stating he had connections and knew individuals who could procure items not readily available. Leonid surmised it might involve an underground network, possibly linked to dissident groups in Moscow or Leningrad. He did not press the matter further. However, in late October, a shift occurred. Oleg became more guarded and secretive. He began arranging meetings with Leonid at locations away from the university and cautioned Leonid to exercise discretion and avoid attracting attention. One evening, during a conversation in a quiet park adjacent to the Neva River, Oleg inadvertently revealed something significant. He alluded to contacts, those who supported his endeavors. When Leonid inquired about their identity, Oleg smiled and simply replied they were friends from abroad who believed Soviet students deserved access to information their government withheld. A shiver ran down Leonid's spine. Friends from abroad. He did not ask for clarification, but the implication was evident. Oleg was not merely distributing writings of the opposition. He was collaborating with foreign nationals, potentially Western intelligence agencies, to disseminate propaganda on Soviet territory. And by assisting him, Leonid had become entangled in this operation. Galina listened in stunned silence as Leonid concluded his story. Her mind raced. This was far beyond black market dealings or minor pilfering. This was something considerably more grave. Her son, however unintentionally, had seemingly been recruited into an operation that could be construed as foreign espionage. He had accepted payment from individuals with ties to the West to undermine Soviet ideology, influence other students, and betray his nation. A wave of nausea washed over her. Leonid was not a spy, she knew that. He was a naive young man, enticed by money and the allure of forbidden activity. He had failed to grasp the seriousness of his involvement, unaware that the person he considered a friend was using him as a pawn in a much larger scheme. Yet, his ignorance would offer no protection. If the authorities discovered his actions, Leonid would face arrest, trial, and punishment. And the penalties for treason, even for someone who had been manipulated, were severe. Leonid appeared to grasp this now. Seated opposite her, his face ashen and his hands trembling, he resembled a frightened child. He confessed his intention to cease his involvement, stating he had not accepted any money from Oleg for over a week, and acknowledged his grave error. He pleaded with her to keep the matter confidential, to allow him to extricate himself discreetly from Oleg's life and hope there would be no repercussions. However, Galina struggled to think coherently. Her mind was a tempest of fear, anger, and confusion. She instructed Leonid to retire to his room, and he complied silently, retreating like a chastised youngster. She remained alone in the kitchen for hours, her gaze fixed on the wad of money on the table, wrestling with her decision. A part of her yearned to protect Leonid, to devise a means of shielding him from the consequences. Yet another part, shaped by decades of Soviet indoctrination, by cautionary propaganda, and by party directives emphasizing vigilance, asserted this situation transcended personal sentiment. Leonid had been compromised. He had become involved in something that endangered the state, and her inaction, her attempt to conceal it, would make her complicit. Furthermore, if the authorities discovered Leonid's involvement independently, they would presume her knowledge and silence, potentially leading to her own arrest as an accessory. But an underlying conviction guided her thinking. Galina held a genuine belief in the Soviet system. She trusted its fairness, its purpose in safeguarding its citizens, and its capacity for mercy towards those who had strayed. Throughout her life, she had accepted that the party acted wisely, that the state cared for its populace, and that adherence and allegiance would be rewarded. She believed, with a faith bordering on desperation, that by reporting Leonid herself, by demonstrating her own loyalty and her son's readiness to confess, the authorities would exercise leniency. They would recognize Leonid's youth, his manipulation, and his deserving of a second opportunity. He might undergo re-education, perhaps a period in a labor camp, but ultimately, he would be permitted to return, reformed, corrected, and transformed into a more exemplary Soviet citizen. She reiterated this conviction to herself throughout the night. She paced the confines of their small apartment, moving between the kitchen and the living room, her thoughts endlessly circling the same dilemma. By dawn, her decision was firm. She would report Leonid to the KGB. This action stemmed from love, from the conviction that the system would offer him aid, and from the certainty that this was the sole path to saving her son from a fate far more dire than any imposed by the state. On the morning of November 4th, 1978, Galina meticulously dressed in her best attire, a simple, clean, and pressed gray dress, and a wool coat reserved for significant occasions. She informed Leonid she was going out on errands, and he merely nodded, his face weary and drawn, without looking at her. She departed the apartment shortly after 9 o'clock, navigating the chilly streets towards the KGB headquarters. The building was situated in a quiet district, nondescript externally, bearing no signage to identify its function. Galina had passed it numerous times over the years, but had never given it particular notice. Now, as she approached the entrance, her heart pounded in her chest. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the handle, and took a deep breath. Then, she stepped inside. The interior was austere and cool, with bare walls and fluorescent lighting casting a harsh, clinical illumination. A uniformed usher sat behind a desk near the entrance, and he looked up as she entered. Galina approached him, her voice conveying a slight tremor, stating she needed to report a matter concerning state security. The usher observed her for a moment, then lifted a telephone and made a brief call. He instructed her to wait. 20 minutes later, a man in a dark suit emerged and guided her down a narrow corridor to a small office. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Sokolov, though Galina suspected this was not his genuine name. He gestured for her to be seated, and she lowered herself into a rigid wooden chair opposite his desk. He requested an explanation for her presence. Galina, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, began to speak. She recounted the entire affair and presented all the money she had discovered. She described her conversation with Leonid, the acquaintance named Oleg Petrov, and the materials they had been circulating. She explained that Leonid had received payment, that he had not comprehended the full ramifications of his actions, and that he had been manipulated by someone with connections to foreign entities. She emphasized Leonid's youth, his error, and his genuine remorse and willingness to cooperate. Her voice faltered slightly as she inquired if there was any possibility of leniency from the authorities, if Leonid could be granted an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty. Lieutenant Sokolov listened impassively, making notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. Upon her conclusion, he posed a few clarifying questions. Leonid's full name, his date of birth, his place of study, and Oleg's whereabouts. Galina responded to the best of her ability, though she recognized her limited knowledge of Oleg beyond what Leonid had disclosed. After the interrogation concluded, Lieutenant Sokolov shut his notebook and instructed her to go home. He informed her that someone would contact her, that she was to discuss this conversation with absolutely no one, and that she had acted commendably by reporting the matter. His demeanor was impartial, neither offering comfort nor posing a threat, and Galina departed the office with a peculiar blend of relief and apprehension. She ambled home, her steps faltering, and upon reaching the apartment, she found Leonid seated at the kitchen table, his face buried in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and for an instant, their gazes locked. She perceived the question in his expression, yet she found herself unable to respond. She turned away and retreated to her room, closing the door behind her. 2 days later, on the morning of November 6, 1978, officers from the KGB and city militia arrived to apprehend Leonid. Galina was at her workplace, tending to her machine in the sweltering, clamorous factory. She did not learn of the arrest until she returned home that evening and discovered the apartment devoid of occupants. A neighbor, a woman by the name of Vera Ivanovna, residing 2 doors down, intercepted her in the hallway and recounted the events she had witnessed. 3 men clad in dark coats, accompanied by individuals from the militia, had arrived shortly after 10 o'clock. They had knocked on the door, and upon Leonid answering, they had identified themselves and escorted him away. Vera stated that Leonid had offered no resistance, uttered no word, but had simply walked between the men as they guided him to a waiting vehicle. Galina stood motionless in the hallway as Vera concluded her account. After the neighbor finished speaking, Galina expressed her gratitude in a voice that seemed alien to her and entered the apartment. She moved through the rooms mechanically, activating lights, inspecting Leonid's bedroom. Everything remained as he had left it. His bed unmade, books piled on the desk, the wardrobe door slightly ajar. She sat down on his bed and gazed at the wall, her mind blank, incapable of feeling anything but an immense, vacant emptiness. Within hours, the KGB also apprehended Oleg Petrov. Galina would later ascertain, through piecemeal information that surfaced over the ensuing weeks, that Leonid had divulged Oleg's name and pertinent details during his initial questioning. The swiftness of the arrests suggested that the authorities had been both efficient and methodical in their approach. What followed was a process that transpired entirely beyond Galina's view. Leonid and Oleg were held in separate detention centers, interrogated by teams of officers, and subjected to questioning that extended for days. The precise specifics of what transpired during these interrogations remain obscure. However, based on accounts that emerged years later from analogous cases, it is probable that both young men were coerced into making confessions, revealing the identities of others involved, and detailing every encounter, every exchange, and every piece of literature they had disseminated. It is known that the investigation had actually been ongoing for some time prior to Galina's report. The KGB's 5th Chief Directorate, responsible for ideological offenses and dissident activities, had been scrutinizing certain students at Leningrad State University for months, concerned about the circulation of unauthorized materials on campus. Oleg Petrov had been under surveillance since at least the summer of 1978, although investigators had not yet amassed sufficient evidence to proceed with arrests. Galina's report provided the crucial final elements they required: confirmation of the distribution network, specifics regarding remuneration, and most importantly, the names of the individuals implicated. Oleg, it appears, yielded quickly under interrogation. According to sources that surfaced long after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Oleg corroborated his contact with individuals linked to American intelligence. Although the precise nature of these associations remained indistinct even in official documents, some accounts suggest he was recruited through an intermediary at a foreign academic conference in 1977, while others claim he was approached by an individual posing as a Western journalist who visited Leningrad that same year. It became evident during the investigation that Oleg had been receiving regular payments, that he had been distributing materials intended to promote Western ideologies and undermine Soviet authority, and that he had enlisted Leonid to aid him, likely perceiving the younger student as susceptible to persuasion and in need of funds. For the Soviet authorities, this was a matter of considerable gravity. The era was characterized by acute Cold War tensions, and the KGB faced continuous pressure to eradicate foreign espionage operations and thwart ideological subversion. University campuses, where young people were exposed to novel ideas and where foreign students and faculty occasionally mingled, were regarded as environments of elevated risk. The discovery of what appeared to be a Western-funded propaganda initiative at Leningrad State University, one of the Soviet Union's most esteemed institutions, was viewed as a significant security lapse necessitating a robust response. Initially, both Leonid and Oleg were charged under Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, which addressed anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. This charge carried severe penalties, including lengthy prison sentences, but it did not automatically entail the death penalty. Nevertheless, as the investigation advanced and interrogators pressed Oleg for further details concerning his foreign liaisons, the case was reclassified. By mid-December 1978, the charges against both young men had been elevated to Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, treason. The reclassification appears to have been influenced by political considerations as much as by legal ones. The authorities intended to send a strong message and make an example that would deter other students from engaging in similar conduct. The trial, if it could be so described, took place within a closed tribunal at some point in late January 1979. There was no public announcement, no opportunity for family members to attend, and no defense counsel willing to contest the charges. The proceedings were concise and perfunctory, with the outcome preordained. Both Leonid and Oleg were convicted of treason against the Soviet state and sentenced to death by firing squad. On February 14, 1979, Valentine's Day in the West, although the date held no particular significance within the Soviet Union, Leonid Petrovich Volkov was executed. Oleg Vladimir Petrov was executed on the same day at the same location, which was almost certainly a military facility on the outskirts of Leningrad. The executions were carried out in secrecy, with no witnesses present beyond the personnel required to participate. The bodies were transferred to the custody of the MVD and interred in an undisclosed location, likely an unmarked plot in a restricted area where executed prisoners were routinely buried. No records were kept of the precise burial sites, and families were never informed of their loved ones' final resting places. Galina learned of her son's demise several weeks after it occurred. In March 1979, A KGB officer appeared at her door late one evening. He presented her with a brief official notification, typed on thin paper and bearing an official stamp. The notice stated that Leonid Volkov had been found guilty of crimes against the Soviet state under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, and that the sentence had been executed in accordance with Soviet law. It provided no details regarding the trial, no information about the execution date, and no indication of where Leonid was buried. The officer informed her that the matter was classified, that she was not to discuss it publicly, and that any further inquiries would be viewed with suspicion. He then departed. Galina stood in the doorway, the notice still clutched in her hand, and felt something within her fracture. The son she had attempted to protect was dead. The system she had confided in had extinguished him. And as hours elapsed and the reality of what had transpired began to set in, she recognized that her faith, her allegiance, her belief that the state would be compassionate, all of it had been a fabrication she had sustained. But the worst was yet to unfold. Within days, Galina discovered that her involvement in Leonid's arrest had become common knowledge. It is unclear precisely how the information disseminated, whether someone had observed her entering the KGB office, whether the account had leaked through unofficial channels, or whether the KGB itself had subtly indicated that Leonid's own mother had reported him. In Soviet society, where neighbors observed neighbors and everyone lived in close proximity, secrets rarely remained concealed for long. The reaction was immediate and severe. Galina's neighbors, individuals with whom she had resided for nearly 2 decades, began to shun her. Vera Ivanovna, who had always been cordial, now averted her gaze when they passed in the hallway. The couple residing downstairs, who had occasionally invited her for tea, ceased to acknowledge her presence. One morning, Galina discovered a pile of refuse deposited outside her apartment door. At the factory, the ostracism was even more pronounced. Her colleagues, who had once conversed with her during breaks and included her in their discussions, now fell silent as she approached. During lunchtime, she sat isolated at the far end of a long table, and no one met her eyes. Her supervisor ceased assigning her to group tasks, effectively isolating her at a machine in a corner of the factory floor where she could work without any interaction. The trade union committee, of which she had been a member for years, quietly removed her from its roster without explanation. However, the most devastating blow emanated from her own family. Galina had a younger brother, Anatoly, who resided in Moscow with his wife and their 3 children. Upon learning of the events, and Galina never ascertained the source of his knowledge, he dispatched a brief, cold letter to her. In it, he wrote that he could not comprehend how she had betrayed her own flesh and blood, that he wanted nothing to do with her, and that she should never contact him or his family again. The letter concluded with a solitary line: "You chose the state over your son. May you live with that choice." Galina initially attempted to explain her actions. She told anyone who would listen that she had acted out of love, that she had believed the authorities would assist Leanne, and that she had never envisioned the outcome would be so dreadful. However, no one paid heed. To them, she was a woman who had sent her son to his demise, and no justification could erase that fact. In a society where informing was both encouraged and reviled, where the state depended on citizens reporting on each other, yet everyone detested those who did, Galina had committed the ultimate betrayal. She had informed on her own child. Over the subsequent months, Galina withdrew into herself. She ceased attending the factory social gatherings she had once enjoyed, stopped attending party meetings, and withdrew from the communal life of her building. She went to work each morning, operated her machine in silence, and returned home each evening to an empty apartment. She prepared simple meals for one, ate without savoring the food, and spent her evenings sitting in the dark, gazing at the walls. Galina's health began to decline. She lost weight rapidly, her face becoming gaunt and hollow, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. She developed a persistent cough that worsened over the weeks, and her colleagues at the factory observed that she moved more slowly, as if each step demanded immense effort. She took no sick days, possibly because work was the sole routine she had left, the only reason to leave her apartment each morning. However, her deterioration was apparent to anyone who observed her. In late July, Galina collapsed at her machine. She was transported to a hospital where physicians diagnosed her with severe pneumonia and acute malnutrition. She spent 3 weeks in a ward, lying in a narrow bed surrounded by other ill and dying patients. During that entire period, not a single individual came to visit her. No coworkers, no neighbors, no family. The nurses attended to her with clinical efficiency, but there was no warmth, no compassion. When she was finally discharged, she went back to her apartment and tried to resume her life, but something fundamental had fractured within her. Galina died alone sometime in September 1979. The precise date remains unknown. She was discovered in her apartment after failing to report for work for several days. She was found on the floor of the small kitchen where she had once prepared meals for her family. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure secondary to exhaustion and chronic illness. But those who had known her believed she had simply given up. She was nearly 52 years old. Her funeral was arranged by the state, as was customary for all Soviet citizens who died without family to claim them. The service was brief and sparsely attended. No family, mostly distant acquaintances who felt compelled to be present. There were no flowers, no eulogies, and no tears. Galina Volkova was interred in an unmarked grave in a public cemetery on the outskirts of Leningrad. Her name was added to a ledger that would eventually be lost amidst the upheaval of the Soviet Union's dissolution. The case of Leonid Volkov and Oleg Petrov was never officially acknowledged by the Soviet government. The KGB's files on the matter remained sealed within what later became the FSB archives, and even after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, numerous documents pertaining to the Cold War era remained classified. What little is known about the case originates from hushed conversations among former university students, brief references in memoirs published during the more open atmosphere of the 1990s, and oral histories collected by researchers documenting Soviet-era repression. The apartment building where Galina and Leonid resided still stands today in St. Petersburg. The gray concrete tower appears much as it did in 1978. Weathered but still functional, it continues to house families who are unaware of what transpired there. Galina's grave lies unmarked in a cemetery that has been expanded over the decades, and no one visits it. Leonid's burial site remains unknown. His body was likely interred in an unmarked mass grave that may have been built over long ago. Their story is one among thousands from that period. Families were demolished by the machinery of the Soviet state, sacrificed to an ideology that promised justice but delivered only cruelty. Galina had been a devoted believer who discovered too late that the system she trusted cared nothing for her or her son. She had acted out of faith, and that faith had destroyed everything she cherished. In the end, both mother and son became casualties of a system that demanded absolute loyalty and showed no mercy to those who failed to understand that loyalty was never enough.